This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. I know these times are difficult times and a lot of us are working remotely, but for us, the timing has worked in our favor in that so many of you are working from your home offices now and are sitting at your computers. And what a great time to take advantage of the situation and add to our professional development skills. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Linda Katz-Wilner, and I am a communication and soft skills specialist. My company is Successfully Speaking. I help individuals from all backgrounds achieve excellence in communication. And in the past 2 years, I've been running a series, The Hard Facts About Soft Skills. This has been a phenomenal opportunity for me to meet with experts in the field of all aspects of soft skills and to work with people and have an audience of especially HR professionals who are dealing with this every day. And we've had the series, and recently we made it into a virtual lunch webinar series because we know HR professionals typically aren't going to leave their office to come necessarily because their days are so busy, and we wanted to make it easier. Little did we know that a lot of them would be at their computers anyway. Okay.
Hello.
What I'd like to do is to just talk a little bit about some of the organization of this webinar. We are going to have 45 minutes of content. And let me just mute whoever may be. We are going to have 45 minutes of content. The webinar, if you only have the 45 minutes, you'll get all of the content by then, but Ryan and I will stay for further questions. However, there is a hard stop at 1 o'clock because we know a lot of you have other calls and other things that you have to do with your day. At the end, we will send you a survey. Please complete the survey. It just helps us know what works, what you'd like us to do better, and so we can continue to improve the webinars because we do have one every month. What I'd like to do first now is to welcome Ryan McShane, who I've known for many years. We've both been in HR organizations together, particularly the Chesapeake Human Resource Association. And we've spoken a lot, have lots of overlap in how we work with our clients. And I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to include Ryan McShane in this interview series. So welcome, Ryan.
Thank you so much for having me, Linda. And I really appreciate you doing these webinars and mini conferences because I think they're so valuable for not only HR professionals, but anybody working today.
Absolutely. And Ryan, tell us a little bit about you and your background for those who don't know you.
Sure, happy to. So I've been in human resource management for 20 plus years now. And it's been such an incredible experience and very diverse experiences throughout my career as well. I've worked in the public sector, the private sector, startups, and even nonprofits. And as of recently, in the last 4 years, I've launched my own HR consulting business where I primarily focus on working with the C-suite to close skill gaps in professional development, and then I also support persons in career transition. So it's really kind of a unique experience in that I get to work in terms of both ends of the workforce spectrum, supporting the leadership realm and then supporting those who may be entering into the workforce. One really feeds the other because I really get a nice, unique perspective working with individual clients in transition in terms of what they're looking for in their new employment experience. And it's not just about the job role. They're really looking for a culture. They're looking for the kind of leadership that supports them and empowers them. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about is that shift from control to empowerment. And how powerful that can be to unleash the energy aligned to the purpose of the organization.
And who would have thought that the word shift would be such a pervasive word in our vocabulary now because we're shifting day to day. Things are changing. I did neglect, and I'm looking at the screen right now, and I neglected to mention one of the most important things, and that is we want your questions. If you have questions, type them in. We will respond to them and we'll be available at the end, but we want the questions even as I'm asking Ryan some questions, because I'm sure all of you will have some that would be relevant. So don't hesitate to post questions. So Ryan, why don't we start with what do you feel is the most important element in sustainable business success?
Well, I don't think we can talk about sustainable business success or any kind of success in a professional forum without talking about leadership. I think it all comes down to leadership. I think it's lost on many people how impactful leadership is in terms of the direction of the organization and how they operate. Everything is predicated on the leader and what that leader permits in terms of how we carry out the business and how we proceed with trying to accomplish the purpose of the organization. So everything really falls under the leadership umbrella. And I think the importance of that is not lost on me and not lost on most people in terms of their experiences. And I think that we've all heard it said before that most people don't leave jobs, they leave bosses. And that really comes down to the leadership notion of how are you being led on a regular basis. And I think this current situation that we're in with the coronavirus is a great example of that. Leadership that begins and ends with empathy and compassion is precisely what we need right now in our society, but also in our professional workforce.
And today, and it is very timely, absolutely. And we did not intend for this when we planned this webinar. What do you feel has created today's leadership crisis?
That's a great question. So if you look around us, everything has changed. Everything, let's look back a few years. We were the microwave society, the VCR society, then it became DVDs, and now it's all electronic MP3s. Everything, technology has changed around us tremendously. Even our industry has changed around us tremendously. And we're no longer the industrialized society that we used to be. We have shifted into a service-based economy. And so when everything around us has changed, except our leadership modality, we experience the pains of that dichotomy. And so we're experiencing the pains of that dichotomy right now because by and large, we're still operating from a leadership modality that was created over 130 years ago, or was really enacted and activated over 130 years ago. And that term that we're looking for in terms of leadership is authoritarianism. You know it as well as I know it. It's command and control, do what I tell you because I'm your boss. And really your only job as a follower under that type of leadership is to comply. And we know that authoritarian leadership produces really one thing, and that's minimal compliance. What can I do? How can I do just enough to get by without getting in trouble? And that seems to be the mindset of a lot of workforces today. And we see that represented in engagement statistics and figures. Across the nation, it's close to 60 to 70% of our total workforce who are disengaged. And what does that mean to be disengaged? Well, if we're disengaged, we're doing just what I had said. We're only doing enough to get by without getting in trouble. We're not looking about how can I offer more energy, more of my discretional energy to support the purpose of this organization? How can I step out of my comfort zone and constantly push myself to grow and align with the purpose of the organization? So these are some things that we're going to be covering and talking about as we go through the session as well.
Okay, and I guess from what I'm hearing from you is it also squelches people's creativity. And we know millennials may have a different way of working. And so if you're put in a box and told what to do, you probably get a lot of resistance from that. I'm assuming.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So if fear and intimidation is your modality of leadership, you're shutting down your employees' creativity and innovation and asking them just to be compliant, to be more like robots. Just do what I tell you, just like your computer. Let me punch in the code and ask this computer to do what I want it to do, and it should give me back what I'm looking for. Well, we are well beyond that in terms of what we bring to the table. And we know that intuitively when we work with folks. It's the intangibles that really make that an enlivening and engaging experience. So that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about as we move forward as well.
And I know, Ryan, you've told me some trends. I'm going to run through them so you can talk about that, because they're startling, some of these statistics.
Yeah, so one of the trends that is really prevalent today is the fact that we have more millennials in the workforce than we ever had before. And obviously, timing is everything. By 2020, 2/3 of the workforce will be millennials. And so check your watch, folks. It's 2020 now. So are your workforce environments and demographics representative of this figure? That's a question I have for our audience. Is that, do you currently have the workforce demographics that represent the society that we live in today? And if you're still operating from the mentality of we don't need millennials in here using their phones instead of creating relationships, then that's something that we really need to examine and really need to look at. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with hiring managers and leaders in companies, and their first thought to me in terms of hiring and talent attraction is, oh, I don't want any millennials in here. I want to have someone who's a little more experienced, or is not going to be playing with their phone, or is not constantly looking for breaks or different things that this environment doesn't have to offer. And so what we're doing is we're holding millennials at arm's length when we really need to be embracing them, because that's the new generation of talent that's coming in to operate our workforce now and in the future.
So I'm wondering if I think everybody might say yes, that they have these statistics in the workplace. Perhaps the better question to ask is, does anybody see that it doesn't fit with their company? Does anybody feel that they have different statistics? People say embrace millennials. Does anybody work in the audience work in an organization that does not have many millennials? Because I'd be curious what organizations that might be, if that's the case. And we'll monitor the chat box to see if anything comes in on that. But let's look at another statistic here. You gave this to me.
Yeah, so another megatrend, and I call these megatrends because of their sheer numbers of influence that they have on our society and our workforce today. And as you can see here, boomers are retiring, and actually 1 every 6 seconds, according to statistics. And there's not enough in the Generation X, the generation that came right behind the boomers, to replace all those vacated positions. And then we've got a real issue of loss of institutional knowledge. And I like to write on the side, and I've written a couple articles to this effect. But what happens when your go-to person is gone? That go-to person that has been there for 20, 30 years and knows, how all the intricacies of the culture work in the organization and how to get things done in that environment. When they're gone, are they going to take all that wonderful institutional knowledge with them to retire to a beach in Delaware or Florida or one of those places? And then we have a loss, a sucking chasm of all that information flying out of the workforce. That's something that we need to prevent. And when you look at statistics right now, less than 45% of Fortune 500 companies have any kind of formalized succession planning in place. And that's pretty alarming. That's at the Fortune 500 level. Those companies are large enough that they may be able to get away with some of that by having a constant stream and pipeline of talent coming into that workforce by the sheer size of it. Where succession planning is going to be much more impactful for the continuity purposes, for capture of the institutional knowledge and knowledge management, is in those smaller companies. The mom and pops, the 50 to 100 person company, they are the ones that really need to capture that institutional knowledge before it retires.
So with authoritarian leadership, you're not even allowing the other younger people coming into the workforce to have some, not authority, but to be part of the process. And I think that's what you're leading towards with this shift.
Very much so. Have you ever heard, the next time I want to hear your thoughts, I'll tell you what those are. I mean, that is one of the most common authoritarian type of statements that you've ever heard, but it's not lost on me because I've experienced those kind of things within my career. Um, in fact, just a quick story for you. My very first HR role, I worked for the federal government at the Department of Defense, and it was in an HR environment. We were doing all kinds of HR transactions and so forth. And my supervisor, granted, I was 21 at the time, but my supervisor told me directly, point blank, Ryan, I can't respect you because of your age. Well, my head almost popped off. I could not believe what I was hearing. And that demonstrated that person's bias, where that person was, and how they saw the world around them, and how they saw authority figures. And authority figures were aged professionals. In her mindset, someone younger than her did not deserve respect or equal treatment. And that was something that was quite astonishing to me. So that was definitely disillusionment number one in the workforce, and quickly recognized that leaders in that case were not like mom and dad. They did not necessarily have your best interest in mind. They weren't there to see you succeed and empower, but to perform based on an agenda as they understood it.
And Ryan, we have some comments. Cecilia Matthews said that we've many millennials and our leaders have trouble relating. And then Audrey said we have to embrace all demographics in the workplace, especially millennials. They are our future. Learn ways to engage within their communication style, which is right up my alley. And this makes you a great leader with the right skills. So those are two great.
I would agree 100%. I think the reason that most leaders are having trouble relating to millennials is because a lot of it comes from judgment. Judgment of this is how you're supposed to act, this is how you're supposed to dress, this is how you're supposed to do this or that or the other. And so what we recognize of the millennials is they have really eschewed and thrown off all these customs and aspects that we have been exposed to. For example, I used to work in an environment where if they didn't see you sitting at your desk, you weren't working. And that idea right now is it's just astonishing that people would still embrace that idea, but you'd be surprised how that unconscious thinking really seeps into our everyday judgments and characterization of the world around us. So I think a big part of why leaders aren't necessarily connecting with the millennials is because of this judgment factor. They expect the millennials to act as they had, and how foolhardy is that? That's an expectation, given that they've grown up in a completely different environment. And if they look back to their parents, the veterans and the seniors that are boomers that are listening to this and have those expectations, they could probably easily see that that they can't be expected to act like their parents. They act like the generation in which they came up in. And so really it's incumbent upon the leaders to meet their followers where they are and bring them along to where we want them to be. Anything other than that creates a judgment, creates a division, and a chasm of understanding between the generations.
And then we have to have leadership development, right? So I'm going to move past through these trends fairly quickly so we can get to the meat of what we're talking about with the leadership. So you also, this is interesting, that more than 40% of the workforce will operate as free agents. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. So maybe some of you in the audience have heard the term gig economy. Well, gig economy, you think of it like a musician. They go to a gig, they set up, they present, they do their show, and then they wait till the next gig that they've secured and they go and work in that fashion. And the gig economy really speaks to a growing number of contractors out there. And so what's creating this? What's brought this about, I think, is the changing nature of the full-time and part-time employment relationship. This has implications on both ends of the spectrum, not only from an employer's perspective as to how do we attract the best and brightest talent to our workforce, but also for the job seeker is how can they continue to brand themselves for these opportunities, for these gigs. And so we've seen this number grow exponentially, and it's expected to increase and eclipse 40% of the total workforce available will be operating in this fashion. Not least of which is the growing cost of healthcare that has contributed to this. Contractors typically aren't paid those kind of benefits. And so that's something that's attractive from an employer standpoint. But you also, as HR people know, we don't have the same kind of relationships traditionally with contractors that we do full-time employees or part-time employees from that standpoint. So there's definitely some implications and things that we need to look at. And here again, that's where we bring in the term shift. We have to constantly be looking at what is our current environment telling us? What are the statistics telling us? What are the behaviors telling us so that we can continue to shift to accommodate the kind of environment that is our present day circumstance so that we can, again, meet people where they are to bring them along to where we need them to be. And that's all defined in our purpose, in our vision, in our mission in the organization.
And Cecilia just mentioned that she agrees about the judgment factor because even when it comes to dress, that some leaders will still wear suits, but yet not everybody in the organization will do that. And many of the customers, I'm reading Cecilia's note, that many of the customers are also millennials. So you want the customers also to relate to the leadership. So you have to start to even think about that when it comes to dress. There are so many aspects to this. Now, and I know as a subcontractor that I'm one of these free agents. Sometimes I never meet HR. So I'm an outsider coming in. So we don't always have that connection to the organization when we're there.
And that's a good point. That's a good point. Where does the orientation and onboarding typically take place? That's through HR. And so if contractors aren't working with HR, then we're missing out on an opportunity to set the tone of the organization. This is how we interact with one another. This is how we relate to one another. This is how we make decisions in this organization. And this is also how we handle conflicts in an organization. And I often say you can tell more about an organization in terms of how they fight than how they work together. Is it a no-holds-barred, bloody cage match type of environment in terms of every time we disagree with one another, or do we have processes and systems in a congenial way in which we address conflict in our workforce? How's that being illustrated? And if you're not getting that information, and if you're not keyed into or onboarded in that regard, then you're missing out a great deal, and you're a detractor from that type of culture that the leader wants to implement in that environment.
Absolutely. So let's move on. Let's move forward and talk about this, the leadership or power. What do you mean by that?
So when you look at authoritarian leadership, and I hesitate to even call authoritarianism leadership because really it's more of a power dynamic. Anything whereby one person in a recognized position of authority operates from control theory, and control theory tells us that the person with the control believes that they have all the answers, and it's their followers' role to follow along as a part of the edict from the leader. And so that's more of a power dynamic than it is true leadership. And so that's where I go back to what I said before. Much of what we experience is the command and control, do what I tell you, leadership or power dynamic of, you're going to be treated with either you comply or there's going to be a threat associated with that. Well, that creates fear in the work environment. So think about what fear does to us in terms of being able to relate to other people, in terms of how we behave individually. When we're highly in a fear-based mode, when we're stressed out, what happens within us, biochemically speaking, is that we revert to a fight or flight type of response within us. And so that fight or flight response, what is happening within us is the blood in our system is actually diverted from our prefrontal cortex, where all that higher processing and creativity takes place, into our most reptilian aspect of our brain, into the hippocampus, to equip us to either fight, flight, or freeze. And so if you want creativity, if you want innovation, if you want people to really operate out of the best of who they are, then you want them to not feel constantly in fear. You want them not to be in a continuous mode of stress. Certainly there needs to be a sense of urgency in what we do, but that's a very different thing than the stress and the intimidation and the power dynamics that we see all too often proliferate in our workforce.
And I think also, Bill said that the silos are competing rather than working together. So who are the leaders?
Right.
The leaders in the silos, but then there's the leaders in the organization. So
Very
we
good
have
point.
only about 15 more minutes of content. So I want to move quickly to some of the content, Ryan. I think I may have missed the shift here. So I think this is what you want to talk about, that how do we go from this traditional leadership to the conscious leadership that you're talking about?
Yes, that's great. So that's what this is really all about. If you look at the left-hand side of the slide in front of you, you see that traditional leadership is predicated on whatever will create profits. And so the approach is generally what will legally and sometimes illegally generate profit. And it's predicated on a pressure approach, top down, do what I tell you. And decisions are primarily based on money. Is this going to save us money? And the unfortunate factor of that is all too often when every decision is based on money, it compromises the people that you're trying to serve. It compromises the stakeholders that you are aligned to be a part of your ecosystem within that workforce culture. And so we shift over to the conscious leadership approach, and that's predicated on our higher purpose. So everything is relegated to what are we here to do? What is our purpose? What is the vision? What is the mission within the organization? Everything that we do, from the positions that we have in the organization to how we interact with one another and how we serve our customers and clients, is predicated on the purpose that we're trying to achieve. Then that brings us to stakeholder and having a stakeholder orientation. And that's very different than a stockholder orientation. In the traditional leadership approach, it's all about producing increased stockholder value. And so when that is the impetus, again, that's all based on money. A stakeholder orientation says we will do no one thing in benefit of one stakeholder group to the detriment of another stakeholder group. And so you can see that that philosophy has a much more equally balanced ecosystem to operate from that serves everybody within that ecosystem. And then we look at conscious leadership and then conscious cultures. And so the approach here is that we are purpose driven. We create value for all stakeholders. We have a shared vision that everyone buys into and recognizes within the organization. And you walk into most organizations today and you pull an employee aside and you say, hey, what's your mission statement? Most of them will stare at you very quickly with a blank stare and then be embarrassed that they can't articulate what that mission or vision is. And that's certainly embarrassing for those folks. But it really is indicative of how we have strayed from why we exist as organizations. That purpose should be right on the tip of the tongues of those people that are a part of that ecosystem. Decisions based on purpose and stakeholder value, I had mentioned that as well. And I think if you move on to the next slide, you'll see a little bit more in terms of conscious leadership. So the big question that is often asked is, how do we make this shift in and of itself? And so as you can see from the visual here in the middle, we have higher purpose and core values. And that higher purpose and the core values really is the foundational information of every organization. Why are we here? How do we interact with one another? And how do we operate? And so all of that is going to be activated by the type of leadership at the helm. So even if you have a great purpose and you have great core values, if you have a leader who doesn't operate from this standpoint and still operates from an authoritarian mode, then you're not going to really enjoy the benefits of a conscious culture. And so what we need to do is maintain that conscious culture and management approach through having all of these elements come together: the stakeholder orientation, the conscious leadership, and the conscious culture. And the conscious culture says, how do we want our clients to see us? How do we want our coworkers to see us? How do we want our community to see us? And ultimately, that's what we want. We want to be seen for who we are. And so I used to work for an organization that, by all respects, outside of the organization, we were viewed as rock stars, that we could do no wrong, and we just really operated at a high level. Inside the organization, it was very different. It wasn't uncommon for leaders to eat their young, if you know what I mean when I say that. We cannibalize ourselves internally, trying to be so externally focused. And we need to be equally internally as well as externally focused, because if you're not taking care of yourself, you can't take care of others. It goes back to that whole airplane kind of idea. Put the mask on yourself first, and then put the mask on the child or the person sitting next to you. And all too often, we've been so externally focused that we forgot to put the mask on ourselves, and we are fading quickly. So what we need to do is start focusing on ourselves internally, and then that comes to bring about the kind of external focus that is much more in alignment with serving our shareholders, our stakeholders.
So it's conscious. Think about it. Be aware of what you're doing.
That's exactly right. And that compares to what's called an accidental culture. An accidental culture is predicated on the things that we hear all too often. Well, we've always done it that way. We've always done it that way. And that, from an HR standpoint and a natural change agent standpoint, that's the bane of my existence, is to hear when people say, we've always done it that way. Well, that doesn't make it right. And it certainly doesn't make it in alignment with who we are and who we want to be and fulfilling our purpose as an organization.
And don't you want to maintain the people who are working in your organization and not have them leave and go elsewhere because they're not happy with the leadership? Because I'm sure.
Very good point. Very good point. Go ahead.
Tell us a little bit about what the problem is with the traditional or authoritarian or the control type leadership. I mentioned already the high turnover.
Yes, and we also talked about engagement factors. And with 60 to 70% of the employees being disengaged in their workforces, they're just sitting back in many respects and collecting a paycheck and doing as little as possible without getting in trouble. And so that's a big part of the problem, is we don't, from a leadership and employer standpoint, we're not getting what we're paying for out of the employees when that's their mindset and their modality of operations. But even more so, the high performers are really disenfranchised by that kind of environment where it's status quo. Don't stick out your head for fear to be chopped off. Just sit back and do the basics of your job. those aren't empowering or inspiring work environments. And I think that's ultimately what we're coming to realize is work is not just how you get a paycheck at the end of the day, but we are self-actualizing to a great extent through the work that we do. What is your purpose? Why are you here on earth? And can you align that to your professional role? And I think that's what people are longing for in their workplace, in their workspace today, is an environment where they can be truly who they are and manifest that and have opportunities to continue to grow. Well, authoritarian work environments don't typically offer many of those opportunities. Why? Because they want you to be compliant and do what you're told. And so if too many people are thinking outside of the box, that's too often the challenge to leadership that they don't invite and they really try to mitigate to a great extent.
Now, Lou had a very interesting comment, and he said that he experiences the reverse discrimination as a boomer.
Yes.
The X generation the X gen just assumes he's traditional because he's a boomer, and he doesn't get the opportunity to demonstrate the conscious leadership model. That to me is shocking, that you want to embrace the model, but people don't perceive that you can because you're a boomer.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear it, but it's not surprising whatsoever. And it's across all generations that we see each other as being so different. And it's how we've been conditioned that's been very different. But ultimately, past the conditioning, we're all the same. And that's where we need to start having more conversations about values. What is it that you value in the workforce that you operate? What is your thinking? What is your behavior? What is it ultimately that you invest in terms of values in the workforce that you find that is so critical today? And I think that values are the ultimate unifier. When we start talking about values, then we have a common language from which to develop everything from that standpoint. Do you want to be treated with respect? Yeah, so do I. Wonderful. So how are we going to do that? How do we make sure that that's a part of our culture? Do you want to be appreciated for the talent that you bring to the table, whether it be from a diverse perspective or not? Certainly.
And Audrey said, this is the common theme of our time now, but she said that disengaged employees are a virus that's rampant due to the poor leadership. So I guess we're blaming the leadership on the disengagement, or that's how you fix it. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that. As we had started out, leadership basically gives us all permission in terms of how we operate in that workforce. And we operate from those permissions based on social contracts and social paradigms that we experience in the workforce. I'm sure we've all heard it said, oh, we don't do that here. Well, that's an indication of the culture and the permission that is based on leadership. And so I do believe that it is incumbent upon leaders to engage their employees, but we also have to have some conversations with employees to determine, what are you engaged by? What is it that drives you? Because if you're expecting to sit back and be entertained by leaders all day long and not contribute your end of the bargain, then we have a mismatch in terms of what our expectations are. So I think we need to talk about expectations to a great extent. In fact, it would be a phenomenal act of creating unification, of really having a deep culture conversation, if we started going into the work environment and saying, as a new hire, these are my expectations for you as the employer. These are my expectations for you as my supervisor. The companies certainly provide their expectations right up front. Here's your job description. We expect you to be able to sell this many this month. And they articulate their expectations primarily from an operational standpoint, but also HR indicates those expectations from an onboarding and cultural standpoint. Where is the opportunity for employees to articulate what their expectations are? And I think it's that part of the conversation that allows leaders to understand how people are truly engaged and how we can meet them where they are.
And Audrey did say it's frustrating because people don't always stand up. And she felt that nobody gets fired for making bad decisions because no decision is irreversible, and it can become that learning experience. So with that in mind, and thank you for that comment, Audrey, what can we do? How can everybody here make that shift? What are your suggestions, Ryan? We have 5 minutes.
So we need to start having some critical conversations in our workforce. We need to start stepping back from all the doing and start asking ourselves, what do we want to be? And that comes from a diverse perspective. It not only comes from your leadership, but it comes from the entire hierarchy across your organization down to the frontline employees. And having some general conversations about how do we want to interact with one another? How do we want to lead our employees? How do we want to make sure that people are attracted to this environment? How do we want to make sure that we continue to engage our employees? What is it that's so important for our top talent to continue to stay and be retained within this work environment? And those are the top 3 things that CEOs and HR professionals concern themselves with on a regular basis is attraction, engagement, and retention. And so when we think about the attraction, is this a diverse environment where your feedback, your input, your professional capabilities and skills are going to be honored in this environment? Is this an environment where you can continue to grow and be surrounded by the best and brightest and have great technology available to you? This is some of the messaging that attracts every generation, not least of which is the millennial generation. And then once they're there, how are we engaging the employees? Are the conversations continuously one way in terms of our communication? This is what I want of you. This is the demand. This is the operational output that we expect. Or are we having those conversations to say, what is it that's important to you in terms of how you carry out your work? And I go back to the opportunities to learn and grow. And so we have a real issue within our workforce today is if we want to keep great individual contributors, we typically promote them and put employees under them. So, if we're doing that, we need to match up that new role with the support that they need to be truly successful. And so that's leadership development, that's continuous growth opportunities. And then from a retention standpoint, we continue those facets to make sure that the culture provides what employees are looking for.
And Ryan, I know we, in these webinars, we like to give some content to the attendees, and you put this together, and we only have a minute or 2, but everybody will be receiving this from an email from you later today or tomorrow. But briefly just talk, we only have about a minute, but briefly talk about this worksheet that you put together for them.
Yeah, so I want to make sure that you're not only just sitting back and saying, okay, this is good information, but how do I operationalize it? How do I activate it? And so we've given you an action planning worksheet to be able to do that. And I've taken different aspects of the slides and the points that we've talked about and set them up in a way where we can look at being purpose-driven. Okay, when we're purpose-driven, how do we activate that? The different facets that we're looking at. What are the actions that you want to take to be more purpose-driven? What are the desired results that you would like to achieve? And then how are you going to hold yourself accountable to those things? And this is also good fodder for conversations amongst your teams. If you're a leader, take this worksheet with you and have some conversations with your employees. If you're working across your leadership group and you want all the leaders to be on the same page, this is a great action worksheet to have those conversations.
And thank you so much for putting this together, because there's so much information here, as well as some of the trends that you spoke about. So what a great takeaway. And I know everybody will be receiving this. It is 12:45, and I know I want to keep us on schedule. What I would like to talk about, and we are here for questions, so we're not leaving yet. But what I do want to mention and let you be aware of, that we do have these every month, And next month, we're going to have Donald Coleman from Who Staffing talking about the interview process. So we will send you information about that, but be aware that every month, except in the summertime, we will be having this. And maybe now with everybody working from home, maybe we should increase the frequency. So give us feedback in the survey afterwards to let us know. Ryan, I want to thank you so much for this information. People are saying in the chat room how informative it is, what a great discussion, and they really enjoyed having this discussion, and it's needed. And at this point, if you, we're not necessarily opening up the phones, but if you can type in questions, Ryan and I would be glad to answer any questions. But again, Ryan, before everybody, or some of the people leave, thank you so much for contributing to this webinar series and giving us such timely information.
Well, Linda, I have to thank you. The work that you're doing around the hard facts for soft skills is so appropriate for this time and what we're experiencing today in the workforce. And I applaud all that you're doing. And it's just an honor to be a part of it.
Well, thank you. And do we have any questions? I don't see any coming up in the chat box. Let's see. Ironically, what I did for HP as a conscious designer is what leaders have to enable in others. Let me just say that again from Bill. Nice session. Ironically, what I did for HP as a conscious designer is what leaders have to enable in others. Okay.
Precisely, and I know what Bill's talking about. Is really kind of stepping back and looking at how they want to be. We step into organizations, and the first thing that we're trying to do is figure out what are the rules and paradigms under which I'm to operate in this environment. We may make some mistakes and have to back up and start again, type of thing. But what if we started out with a framework where we're constantly asking ourselves, what is most appropriate to be doing in this environment? How do we want to interact with one another, and not allow it to be an accidental culture based on the personality of the person at the leadership helm at that time?
Mm-hmm. All right. Are there any other questions from anybody? I'm looking here. Some people have to sign off because they have that next meeting, which I know happens, especially with
Understandable. HR. And I'm so grateful that so many of you have joined us today, wherever that is. If you're working remotely or you took time, out of your day-to-day at the office to join us online as well. And again, thanks to Linda for having the enablement of this webinar so that we can continue to connect.
And thank you, everybody, and look for an email to get the recording. You can share that with people, and you'll know about our next event. So thank you very much, everybody. Be safe, be healthy, and we will get to the other side of all this.
Thank you, Linda.
Sure.